Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to AgForestry-to-Go. This is our new webinar series. My name is Kara Kalber, Program Manager for the Ag Forestry Leadership Program. And today I am welcoming Kyle Garrison with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Kyle is an ungulate specialist for WDFW. He has studied wildlife biology at the University of Montana and at New Mexico State University. Kyle has worked with a variety of wildlife, but his passion has always been ungulates, which are hoofed animals like deer and elk. In Washington, Kyle has worked on bighorn sheep, deer, and elk research and management with current focus on elk management. So with that, I would like to welcome Kyle Garrison. And if you guys could please put any questions that you might have for Kyle in the question and answer box that's located at the bottom of your screen. If you just click on that, I'll be monitoring that, and then Kyle will be taking questions after his presentation. So with that, Kyle, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kara. I'm pleased to be here and excited about this opportunity to share some information about hoof disease. As Kara said, I'm an ungulate specialist for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm based in Olympia, Washington, and before this position, I've been in about a year. Focused on elk management primarily. I was the hoof disease coordinator for a few years. So my background with this agency in the state of Washington has pretty much been focused on hoof disease. This is a big story. It's while short in a relative term, there's been a lot that's happened in the 10 to 15 years. This disease has been on the landscape and been a large and pressing issue for elk management in the state. So excited to be here and excited to give this talk. I am going to cut out my video feed for the sake of bandwidth conservation between my wife and I, since we are sharing a somewhat limited internet connection here. So we'll do that and hop right in. So the title of the talk, of course, is just an overview of elk hoof disease in Washington. Today's content is a background on a little bit on elk in general, and a longer overview and background on the disease and its history. And I'll move into some of the efforts that the Department of Fish and Wildlife has conducted to understand the disease and its causes, and also to try to quantify and understand the impacts this disease is having on elk. I'll talk a little bit about the management of this disease and some of the things we're looking forward to toward management, and I'll also discuss some of our future work and future collaborations. And I'm going to try to leave plenty of time toward the end of this talk for discussion and question and answer. So probably everyone's aware of what elk are, but I wanted to kind of start really simple and make sure everyone's on the same page. Elk are large-bodied ruminants. They're very common throughout Western United States, and they're becoming increasingly common throughout North America. In Washington, we're one of the few places that is lucky enough to have both subspecies of Rocky Mountain elk and Roosevelt elk within our state. The general distinction of the two species is the Cascade crest, where Roosevelt elk are on the western side and Rocky Mountain subspecies on the eastern side. But there is considerable intermixing across the crest and in certain populations that border each other. Once nearly extirpated, both species nearly extirpated, we did considerable reintroduction efforts and conservation efforts, starting in the mid 20th century and following through to today. We've got about 45 to 55,000 animals across the state. And of course, I think probably most folks are aware that elk are very important and highly valued for cultural reasons, aesthetic reasons, and recreationally. And elk have a high economic and very economically important to the state of Washington. So just expanding on the overview of elk in Washington, this is a map that kind of displays the 10 recognized elk herds. There's actually 11 different shapes in this, but one of them is just splitting up one elk herd. Just to give you an idea that we have elk across Washington. They're fairly well distributed and capable of persisting in very diverse climates and ecosystems. And for this community of agricultural and forestry professionals and folks in that industry, you're probably also very aware of your role in some way or another as an influence in the population dynamics, whether it's through forestry practices or agricultural practices, the conservation of the species and its sustainability, and setting our management objectives. You can think about areas where we have agricultural production and we don't really want elk, whereas we have areas of forestry production where we might be able to have higher levels of elk in balance with, say, industry objectives. And so, of course, we have elk in the classic wilderness settings of, say, the Blue Mountains in southeastern Washington, these grassland with mixed conifer stands of northeastern and central Washington. In western Washington, we have elk in these lowland valleys that are dominated by agricultural livestock production. And of course, the industrial forests and timber producing areas of southwestern and western Washington in general, which create this mosaic of mixed age stands, which produce quite a bit of our elk habitat in western Washington. And it's here in western Washington where we had elk hoof disease emerge. I'm not, we probably are all familiar with this disease to some extent if we're from Washington, but I want to give a background on the history here of the disease. The disease is very much characterized by an animal holding up its leg. It's got a limping gait, possibly and commonly associated with abnormal, overgrown, deteriorated hooves, as you see in these images here on the left. As I said, the disease emerged in western Washington and specifically in southwestern Washington, an area called the Boisfort Valley. It's highlighted here in green on that figure on the right. This is part of the Willapa Hills elk herd area, and for a number of years in its emergence only affected those Willapa Hills elk. We don't really know when the disease emerged on the landscape definitively. There are reports of limping or lame elk that are documented as far back as the late 90s, but certainly the disease was probably on the landscape by the mid-2000s, and we do have reports of the sporadic cases of limping or lame elk in that 2003 to 2005 period. But again, these were very sporadic cases and geographically isolated to this local area. Around 2007, 2008, unfortunately, we saw a really rapid expansion of the disease growing outside of the Boisfort Valley and affecting the Willapa Hills elk herd area quite more, in quite a higher distribution of cases of the disease. And as we looked into this, it was pretty clear that this wasn't something that had been documented before. This is an unprecedented disease that we've not encountered of elk. There are a lot of reasons which might cause an elk to have a limp, and then there are a lot of causes for elk abnormality in their hooves. But we couldn't really associate this disease with any of those causes that we might otherwise suspect and we've seen in other elk populations. And knew that this was a fairly unprecedented and it was really rapidly expanding at this time. Things were happening very quickly in its expansion. Shortly thereafter, probably somewhere around 2010 to 2012, the disease got over I-5 into the Mount St. Helens elk herd area. And this is when we saw the disease really, really rapidly expand in its prevalence and in the number of elk that it affected. There's a lot of background history in the Mount St. Helens elk herd population. It's a really fascinating history from an ecological perspective, post-eruption and the creation of a lot of really good elk habitat. And we had a lot of really good years there where it was a highly productive population that had plenty of habitat and resources to promote the growth and sustainability of a very large elk herd. But as those forest stands began to close and practices began to change, we were left with less habitat to support an elk population at high densities and at the levels it was at. And we slowly began to see those feedbacks, most notably in the nutritional condition of individual elk and through a population-wide scale. And that was pretty well documented leading into the 2000s. Unfortunately, before we were able to lower that population to get it back into balance with its habitat, hoof disease got into the population and really swept through. And we feel very strongly that a major component of that, of the function of prevalence really increasing so rapidly, is because the population at large was fairly dense and was in poor nutritional condition. Of course, I think probably quite a few of you are well aware that this is a controversial subject and was certainly controversial back then. And it's understandable because this is a prized species, and especially when the disease got into Mount St. Helens, started affecting a lot of animals in a very gruesome way, as you can see in these photos. It's scary, and it brings forward a lot of emotion, especially when the causes are not understood. And in that vacuum of not knowing the answers and not knowing what was causing this disease, we had alternative explanations fill in there, and a lot of just overriding concern and confusion about what was going on. So I want to zoom in here really quickly and just show you kind of what this disease looks like up close. So on the left here, you can see this is the earliest, at least earliest outward clinical sign of the disease, where it begins as a lesion, often in the interdigital space between these two hoof claws. That's what you're looking at there on the left. Or alternatively, it can often form along the coronary band where that hoof capsule meets the skin. As the disease progresses, you see on the right here, the invasive pathogens have now invaded underneath and undermined that hoof capsule. You get a little bit of cracking in this image. And occasionally, you see on the other side, if you could flip that over, you might see that the heel bulb has been undermined. And this is just that the disease has progressed and has invaded underneath that hoof capsule. As it continues to advance, you see a lot more severe deterioration and cavitation of those hoof tissues, as you can see on the left there. And this is often accompanied by overgrowth of the hoof claws, which is also evident here. And a lot of the more gruesome images are involved with that really odd, long, overgrown hoof capsule. Ultimately leading to what you see on the right, where the hoof capsule can completely slough off. Both hoof capsules are gone here, and you're left with potentially, sometimes it's healed over or sort of scar tissued. And in this image, you can see that there's still exposed tissues. That's an active wound there. So as I was saying, this disease was really unprecedented. Not a lot was known about the disease, and we couldn't identify it or recognize it as something that's afflicted elk before. We initiated a diagnostic research effort in 2009, which went through 2014. This effort was guided by a panel of technical advisors of animal disease experts, wildlife veterinarians, and wildlife disease experts, and toxicologists. Everyone we could get that we felt could offer some expertise and help us figure this disease out. During this period, we sampled 43 animals, primarily from southwestern Washington, but some also from central Washington, as you can see on this map. And we sampled animals that were outwardly showing signs of hoof disease and animals that weren't, because we wanted to have a comparative analysis of this disease. We sent all these samples to national and international diagnostic labs. And all these laboratories came back with essentially the same conclusions, where they found invasive treponeme bacteria in the diseased hoof samples, but not in the normal or healthy hoof samples. Now, a treponeme bacteria is a group, it's a genus of bacteria. It's fairly diverse, and there's not a ton really known about them, and we don't know all treponemes that are out there in existence. They're a spirochete, and they're shown here, an example of that is shown in the top right here. It's an image of a treponeme, and it's got this really characteristic spiral corkscrew shape. Now, in addition to treponemes, there are also a lot of other bacteria that are found in these diseased hoof samples. And that bacterial profile, that consortium of bacteria, is similar to the consortium of bacteria that we find in a disease called digital dermatitis, which is a hoof disease affecting domestic livestock, most commonly affecting dairy cattle. In that disease and in hoof disease of elk, treponemes are suspected to have a causal role, but there's also a lot of ongoing research as to the roles of other bacteria which are involved in these infections. Given this information, the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Technical Advisory Group issued a consensus statement which diagnosed this disease as treponeme-associated hoof disease. So I want to give a quick overview of digital dermatitis itself and some of the things that we know about digital dermatitis from domestic livestock, because a lot of the information that we know about hoof disease of elk, this treponeme-associated hoof disease of elk, some of the ideas, the hypotheses about how this disease works is gleaned and borrowed from the understanding from domestic livestock research and literature. So digital dermatitis has affected the dairy industry since the 1970s. It's now present throughout the entire North American dairy system and affects other livestock, including domestic goats and sheep, and more recently, beef feedlot cattle. The disease is a major cause of lameness in dairy operations, and especially large dairy operations. Unfortunately, there are no effective vaccines for this disease for domestic livestock, despite a lot of research into that. But there are treatments and some preventative options which are available to domestic livestock. But unfortunately, there are pretty high recurrence rates even post-treatment. The disease is a challenge to manage in dairy systems to this day. And despite all of the research and the long history and that high level of economic impact that it has in livestock production and in dairy systems, there are still a lot of questions that remain, including questions about transmission. And I'll just highlight these photos here, where in the bottom left you can see a very classic form of bovine digital dermatitis, the clinical manifestation of bovine digital dermatitis there on the bottom left. And the two images on the right look a little bit more similar to what we see with elk, and these are from domestic sheep, contagious ovine digital dermatitis. So I'll quickly give an overview of what we understand about transmission, and I guess I could probably cut it short to say that we really don't understand transmission. And there's a lot of questions that remain about this for domestic livestock and digital dermatitis, and that is certainly the case, and maybe even an understatement about how the disease is transmitted among elk. However, we have some broad conclusions that we can make. The disease is generally associated with moist and wet conditions. Soft hooves from moist or wet conditions are often listed as a risk factor associated with this type of disease in livestock production. And the causative bacteria, that consortium of bacteria that we find with this type of disease, is possibly transported to new areas on the hooves of infected animals. We know from domestic livestock literature and research that they found treponemes in the environment of, say, a dairy system or dairy production. And they've also found the disease in oral and rectal cavities of infected dairy cows. And so there's possible environmental contamination happening here in one way or the other from animals themselves. If you're familiar with elk, we have a species that's fairly gregarious. As you see here in this classic image on the bottom left, they're hanging out in a pasture. In Western Washington, these pastures are very often wet and moist, soggy for a long period of the year. And you can see, and you can make a pretty well-informed speculation about how an infected animal, as you can see on that image on the top left, might be depositing or shedding those causative bacteria into the environment, especially when you see things like on the top right, these sort of elk superhighways where they use these same trails in and out. It's muddy. These anaerobic conditions are really good possible breeding grounds for these type of bacteria. But I want to underscore that that's just a hypothesis that's been untested. We don't really know how the disease is transmitted from one animal to another. It's also possible that there's movement of the disease in similar methodologies by the pathogens being picked up on the tires or the boots of recreationists or just folks out driving around. In a similar way that they found that hoof trimming equipment in dairy systems can have these treponemes on the hoof trimming and the hoof knives and require disinfection after they've been used on the hooves of an animal with the infection. So you can piece those things together. And of course, we also may be dealing with independent outbreaks. The disease is emerging in new areas because of the factors which cause the disease and allowed it to emerge in the Boistfort Valley, Well, they exist in other areas potentially, and we're just getting independent emergence of the disease. We really don't know, and there's just a ton of questions here, and it's an area of active research, both from domestic livestock and on elk hoof disease. So talk a little bit about the initiation, the progression of the disease. Again, more questions than we have answers. We do know, as I've said, the disease is polymicrobial, meaning there are more than just treponemes. There are multiple species of treponemes, and there are other additional species of bacteria and genus of bacteria that are involved in this disease, and that changes as the disease progresses. So you see certain bacteria in early stages, and this is borrowed from domestic livestock. So in bovine digital dermatitis, you see a certain suite of species early on. And as that disease progresses, you see it become more of a monoculture of treponemes, which are dominating those lesions and are really the species of bacteria that are really deep in those lesions and in that infected tissue. Some factors, as I've mentioned already, may predispose animals to this type of disease. I already mentioned moisture, and I also mentioned nutrition, which are also risk factors that are associated with the development of this disease in domestic livestock. And we feel that nutrition certainly is probably playing a role with the contraction of this disease, and at least the high levels of prevalence that we see in Mount St. Helens, which I'll talk about in a little while. And moisture has always been a running hypothesis, especially when the disease was restricted to Western Washington. That made a lot of sense based on what we knew from domestic livestock research. However, that risk factor isn't necessarily invalidated, but its importance sort of has to be questioned or at least reanalyzed when we think about the disease emerging in places such as northeastern Oregon, southeastern Washington, and now in Idaho, where we have much drier climates. So potentially moisture is still important for the transmission, but in those areas, maybe transmission doesn't happen as long of an interval during the year, or some type of explanation like that. And what we've learned also about the disease is that it progresses really rapidly in elk. These images here show you that this is the same animal that we captured on 3 different capture events subsequently. One in February 2015, where it had a grade 1 lesion in that interdigital space. In December 2015, less than a year between these two capture events, you see the animals progressed, and now it's in a fairly late stage of this disease, but it's sloughed a hoof capsule pretty recently there. And then in December of 2016, where this animal is now sloughed both hoof capsules and is in the latest, the worst condition of the disease that we found. And unfortunately, in elk, we found limited evidence of recovery from this disease. I'll talk a little bit about some of our work to study the disease in depth and capturing animals. But we have seen animals that have gone from early stages of the diseases, and in one instance, a later stage of the disease, where they have healed and regrown hooves to a somewhat normal extent, but often that's associated with a reinfection down the line, where we had one animal that actually was captured several times and went from healthy to infected, back to uninfected, and then back to infected again. All right, so I'm just going to go over where we find the disease in Washington, some information about the distribution and then the prevalence of this disease. So the distribution of the disease we know is pretty much restricted, or pretty much concentrated in southwestern Washington. We use an online reporting tool where the public can go on if you have an observation of a diseased animal, an animal with a limp or an abnormal hoof, whether it's dead or whether it's dead and you harvested it, or it's alive and walking around in a pasture. We encourage folks to report those observations. As you can see in that map on the left, the reports of where we see diseased elk match up pretty well with where we know based on aerial surveys and those sort of more formal estimates of the disease. But these are unverified. One really important usefulness of this this public reporting tool is to guide surveillance. So folks have gone on there and they said, hey, I saw a diseased animal in Trout Lake. Well, that's when we first detected the disease down in Trout Lake. It's from a public report. We simply can't be out there all the time, and the eyes that are in the woods there's a lot more of them from hunters and recreationists than there are WDFW biologists. And so we really encourage the use of this tool and really appreciate the use of that tool by the public. As I was saying, that often informs the actual confirmed distribution, which you see on the right here. So this is the most up-to-date map of the confirmations in Washington. As you can see, most of our confirmations are in Western Washington, and unfortunately, we see the disease pretty much ubiquitously confirmed in all but I think 1 or 2 counties in Western Washington. In Eastern Washington, we've detected the disease in Walla Walla County, in Kittitas County, and if we include Klickitat County as Eastern Washington, that was back in 2018. This disease is now present, unfortunately, in 8 elk populations, but the intensity of those infections, the number of elk that are affected, varies by population. But in order to estimate that prevalence of the disease, it can be pretty challenging for wildlife diseases in general, but it's really important to the management of diseases and the understanding of that disease. For hoof disease of elk, if there's anything we're lucky for, is that we have a pretty reliable indicator of infection, and that's that abnormal limping gait or an abnormal hoof. So an animal's limping, you're able to, especially where the disease is known, say you see a limping animal in a Mount St. Helens elk population, there are other reasons why that animal might be limping, but it's more than likely because it has hoof disease. We've used several different approaches using that limping gait as an index of the disease. Citizen science, aerial surveys where we flew across all of southwestern Washington, and we've been using hunter reporting since 2016. All of these methods have given us consistent results and fairly reliable results, but they have really considerable trade-offs in either logistical considerations, costs, and or safety. And so we've really focused in on hunter reporting. So this is kind of a busy slide, so I want to just focus first on that figure. This is a map of our game management units that are that have a color gradient based on the number of animals that are reported to have an abnormality in their hooves by hunters. So in Washington, we don't have check stations, and we rely on hunter reporting to get a lot of our information. So if you harvest an elk in Washington, then during your mandatory reporting component, the next question you get asked is, did you see any abnormalities with the harvest, with your elk's hooves? That yes or no response rate gives us a general idea of the proportion of animals that are affected. There's a lot of nuance and subtleties to tease out of these data that I'm not going to get into, but what you can see here is the disease is concentrated in southwestern Washington, as I've said before, and really concentrated in that core area of the Mount St. Helens elk population. One thing to note here is that this map is static, and what it doesn't show you is a sample size. And so some of these GMUs don't have a lot of harvests happen. And so you know, if you only have 10 animals that are harvested in a GMU, plus or minus one person reporting a diseased animal can really sway that average, that proportion of reports. So we're going to have this as an interactive map on our website very soon that'll show you some more of those advanced statistics and give you a better idea how many elk and how reliable that estimate is per GMU. As I said, I'd like to focus really quickly on the core units of the Mount St. Helens elk population. I've just highlighted here in yellow. And in that table below there, you can see the numbers in yellow as well. So in 2016, out of 448 hunters, 40% of them responded that they saw an abnormality. They documented an abnormality of their elk harvest. Now that's a conservative estimate because we know that some hunters miss the abnormalities, especially in those early stages. But it's a relatively good index, and it probably tracks pretty well with what's going on at a greater population level. What I want to highlight here is that we've seen in 2017, 18, and 19, the rate of reports of folks seeing abnormalities on their harvest going down from 32% below again to 27%, and this last license year was at 26%. Still higher than anyone wants it to be, but we're very pleased to see that rate going down. Now, unfortunately, we've also seen the population estimate go down at that same time, so there's some interaction going on there. Nonetheless, it's the right direction for the rate of disease being reported to be going. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the impacts on elk and some of our efforts to quantify those impacts, notably on the on the survival and the productivity of elk. So we initiated a project in 2015 to go and capture and radio collar adult female elk. For those of you who are unaware, really elk populations and ungulate populations in general are driven by that, or most sensitive to the adult female survival rate, which you normally would see as a fairly high rate in healthy or otherwise normal elk populations. So we captured 257, well, we had 257 capture events. We captured 180 unique individual elk at about a rate of 3 to 1 of infected versus uninfected animals. We wanted to focus on the impacts that the disease had on elk, so we wanted a larger sample size of those infected animals. But we also wanted to have a cohort of healthy, uninfected animals for comparative analysis. So I debated as to how to present some of this information, and I hope this isn't too busy. I wanted to show the real figures to give you guys an idea of what we're dealing with rather than just bullet points and broad strokes. These are preliminary data. The analysis for this project is still undergoing. We're closing in on finalizing some of it, and we're hoping to have a report done by the end of this year and published. When we look at body condition, we're measuring a lot of different components when we talk about body condition, but here I present it as ingestive-free body fat, or just simply body fat. I want to focus on that y-axis for a second and illustrate that below 8% body fat at this time of year is considered to be an animal to be in pretty poor condition, and an animal that has probably not a great shot of making it through winter, and certainly not a great shot at being a productive member of that population in terms of recruiting a calf or being pregnant and raising that calf to recruitment. At that 8 to 12% rate, we have animals that are in marginal condition, and that also isn't good. But as you can see here on these box and whisker charts, none of our animals are even achieving are achieving above marginal rates of body fat. You can see here that I've separated out these figures by both whether an animal is uninfected or infected, uninfected being in blue and infected being in green, and also whether or not they're lactating. It's important to separate that lactating component out because lactation is pretty much the most energetically demanding thing that an adult female elk can undergo. And so we would anticipate that even if an animal is healthy, but it's lactating, it might not be in very good condition. So we need to control for that covariate. As you can see in this figure here, we have animals that are diseased and not lactating, and they should be achieving fairly good body condition in the late fall and in the early winter, that are in pretty poor shape. And they run the gamut from basically no body fat up to close to about 10 to 11% body fat, but the majority of that distribution is in that 4 to 7% body fat. Whereas uninfected elk that are not lactating are consistently in that 8 to 10%, a little bit better. But again, this isn't good by any stretch of the imagination for other elk populations. When we look at lactating animals, the difference isn't quite as stark because of that energetic demand of lactation. But you can see that if you're lactating and you are infected, you're in pretty poor shape as well. None of those animals are achieving even marginal condition, and they're pretty poor condition overall, which would be, we would predict that that's going to have pretty important impacts on an ability to become pregnant and an ability to raise that calf successfully. And of course, that's all tied into how productive that population can be and those overall impacts about what we would expect for this population dynamics moving forward. Here again, this is just a different way to look at the data set. So this is body fat again being measured. And we're looking along the x-axis there. I have control animals listed, and those animals are just uninfected. That's just a little a mistake on my part by not listing those as uninfected. And then the following 4 bins are animals that have the infection, going from a single early stage of the infection, multiple early infections, meaning multiple hooves are affected, to a single late stage hoof infected, to multiple late stage hooves infected. And again, broken down by lactation status, not lactating in the light gray, and in black, those animals are lactating. So we would anticipate there to be a difference there. And you can see for uninfected animals listed here as control, single early stage infections and multiple early stage infections, we see that, you know, they're different, but they're not that different. We're not seeing a huge dip in body condition. And we are seeing that characteristic difference in lactation, that effect of lactation on that energetic demand that these female elk are undergoing. But what is really interesting is when you look at those late stages of infection, those are the ones that appear to be really causing quite a bit of impact on body condition. Both whether you're a single or a multiple stage infection, you can see that the point estimates are a little bit lower for late stages of the infection with multiple hooves affected, but they're pretty equivalent. And whether you're lactating or not, you're in really poor shape. You know, you're below 6%. That's really, really bad. So as we'd expect when we look at impacts from pregnancy and lactation, given what I just showed you about body condition, those animals that are uninfected have higher pregnancy rates, about 75%, than infected elk, which is about 48%. You can see that on the left panel here, where control means uninfected and TAD means infected. I apologize if that's confusing for anyone, but you can see that that's a pretty big difference. And a lot of that is driven, the main driver of that is body condition, and whether or not you can achieve enough body condition to actually become pregnant. When you look at lactation, the story is pretty much the same, where we see a very similar concomitant effect on lactation rates. Uninfected elk are about 70%, whereas infected elk are about 47%. What's interesting, while those rates in lactation are pretty different, it does appear we can glean from that a little bit that infected elk are probably able to raise calves at a decent rate. They're able to at least get them to winter. We don't have any information about overwinter survival. But if you have a 48% level of pregnancy on average among those years, but you have a 47% lactation rate, that's indicative of some success in being able to raise a calf through that first 6 months of life. And that is also the same, that sort of similarity, that parallel rate between pregnancy and lactation for those uninfected animals. Now, when we look at survival, we radio collar these animals, and that gave us the ability to monitor their survival over time. These images here on the left just kind of show you some of the more up close photos of the things that we do during a capture, where it's like we're getting a sample there on the bottom left of this animal. We've already strapped that GPS radio collar on there, and then the animal, you know, is up moving around after we've released it, and that collar gives us, you know, plus or minus about 3 years of life, depending on how many animals that got to be deployed on. This figure on the right shows you the survival curves, and hopefully that's not too busy. What we see in that dashed line are the infected animals, these animals with hoof disease, and the solid line are animals without hoof disease, those uninfected animals. And that follows their survival rates through time, beginning on June 1st, the beginning of the biological year. So time zero is in June. As you can see, survival over summer is pretty much the same between the two groups of uninfected versus infected. Summertime is a good time to be elk for the most part, and then going through the fall, even, you know, notwithstanding hunting season and that kind of thing. But as we see, as we get closer to winter and that 200-day mark, and we move through winter and into the next biological year at 365 days, there's a pretty big difference in those survival curves, where over the entire year, infected animals have an average survival of about 63%, whereas uninfected animals have survival around 86%. I mentioned a little bit earlier that adult female survival is one of the main drivers in the population dynamics of an elk population. And we would normally anticipate to see in a hunted population somewhere around 85–90% survival of adult female elk. So that uninfected cohort grouping has survival that maybe is a little bit lower than we'd otherwise anticipate, but it's not anything too startling. But when we looked at that infected animal survival, that's pretty dang low, 63%. Then that would be indicative, depending on the number of animals which are infected, of a population that has a low probability of being, you know, of rebounding and growing in the future in the near term. When we look at the leading causes of mortality, which I don't have a figure here, I'll just list them out. We had about 90 total animals die during this study, but the mortality was dominated by infected elk. 79 of those were animals that had hoof disease and died. The main cause of mortality for infected animals is what we call general debilitation. That's a catch-all term for the effects of malnutrition, which we know are present in elk and Mount St. Helens, and also those effects of the disease, because these are interactive and they're essentially, impossible to tease apart those effects of inadequate nutrition and these effects of the disease and the animal fighting the disease. So that's about 32% of animals that have the disease dying from general debilitation, partly, directly caused by hoof disease. We had a lot of unknown causes because unfortunately we couldn't get to the animal before it was too far scavenged, or it was just inaccessible, or whatever the reason might be. We just couldn't attribute a known confirmation of the cause of death. And predation was about 19% of the causes of death. The leading cause of mortality for uninfected animals, on the other hand, which we had much fewer, on the order around 10 animals that were uninfected that died during the course of the study, so not many. Human caused or harvest is the dominant cause of mortality, 33%. So I think it was about 4 of those animals were harvested. The remainder were unknown causes, disease, and malnutrition, but those are like 1 animal for each one of those bins. So the statistic there isn't maybe all that meaningful because the sample size is quite a bit lower for those uninfected animals. When we take all these vital rates together, where we have animals that are in poor nutritional condition, they are animals that are infected are in worse shape and have a lower probability of being pregnant, and therefore being, birthing a calf, and probably a lower ability to raise that calf successfully, to complete lactation and recruit that calf into the population. We have animals that have lower survival, significantly lower survival if they have this disease. And we have a disease that, while is on the downward trend in terms of prevalence in this population, is still fairly high. You package these things together, and that's what I'm currently working on now with the analysis of this project. This is indicative of short-term and probably long-term impacts on this population that would be depressing the ability for it to grow, especially in relation to what the Mount St. Helens elk population was, say, in the glory days of the early mid-90s. We probably can't achieve that just simply because of the lack of the habitat that is available now compared to then. But we're also struggling now with a population that just has depressed vital rates, which are going to inhibit growth. So this is, I think, the final slide here, and just to talk briefly about the management of this disease and some of the future directions and research that we're moving toward. I think it's important to say that effective management of wildlife diseases is just really challenging and really hard. And the idea of eradication for really any wildlife disease, and especially a disease like treponeme-associated hoof disease of elk, is really is extremely challenging, if not even remotely possible. Eradication of digital dermatitis and domestic livestock production systems isn't part of the conversation there. It's more about prevention and treatment mitigation. Managing it to a level where it's controllable and it's acceptable. Those treatments and the things that they have for domestic livestock to mitigate this disease are somewhat effective for domestic livestock. Things like topical antibiotics or foot baths. They're really just not available for elk. We might be able to take one individual elk and have some success, but when we talk about management of populations and at a population scale, thousands of affected animals, we're not really able to try to go out and do any actual intensive treatment like that at a population scale. So that's kind of off of the table. And while we've learned a lot about this disease, as I've shown you some of the things that we've learned, and I've left out a lot of the things that we've learned and know about the disease system in domestic livestock, there are way more many questions which remain unanswered. And especially when we think about what pathogens are involved, what roles they play, and how they are transmitted and then infect new elk, there's a lot of uncertainty about what management strategies may be effective. Research with some of our collaborators and partners with USDA and recently with Washington State University and their new program and their captive facility is going to really increase our understanding of this disease, and we're extremely excited about that, because answering some of those questions and getting at some of those more fundamental components of this disease is all moving toward informed management and better tailored management strategies to try to get on top of the disease and keep it at a manageable level, and maybe one day working toward eradication. Targeted removal of infected animals would reduce the prevalence of this disease and may interrupt transmission. This is an idea that's been used in a model that's been used to manage wildlife diseases across a lot of different taxa and a lot of different diseases and different types of diseases with various ways that they're transmitted and various causative agents. The idea being that if you have fewer sick animals, they're unable to transmit the disease as effectively or at a high rate to other animals. And over time, you're going to see fewer and fewer. Obviously, taking a sick animal off of the landscape and out of the population reduces prevalence at large in that moment. But what you're really moving toward is trying to get the disease to be less, to reduce possible environmental contamination, reduce transmission, whether that's through the environment or direct animal contact. Again, that's an untested idea. It's unknown as to its efficacy, but it makes sense given what we know about the disease and other management models that we can glean from both wildlife and domestic livestock diseases. In that vein, the Department of Fish and Wildlife has explored this idea several different ways, and right now we're looking at opportunities to leverage the interest from sports persons and the support from sports persons and the public for management through hunters and hunters really affecting the change that we want to see on the landscape. So the idea being that if we can get hunters to help us remove these infected animals from the landscape, it offers recreational opportunity. That animal has not gone to waste. It's not just removed off the landscape and maybe disposed of however way. And what we're looking at is possibly trying to encourage that harvest through an incentive program by asking hunters that if you kill an elk with hoof disease, that you will be rewarded by entry into, say, an exclusive draw for a more premium hunt. A lot of folks that like to hunt elk want to go after a trophy bull, and in Washington, there's more people who want to do that than we possibly have the availability for, the resource for. So it's pretty competitive, and you have to go through a point lottery system to get those permits and those tags. And so by offering this, we may be able to encourage folks to harvest those elk where they otherwise might not if they had an alternative or a choice. And the idea isn't to increase the level of harvest. We want to keep harvest about where it's at. We don't want populations that are declining because of increased harvest. What we'd like to do is increase the proportion of harvest that is represented by disease or infected animals. This is something we're putting forward in our upcoming 3-year season setting process. This will be put out for public input here at the end of or late summer. I think it's in early August. It'll go out for public input. And if you're interested in this, you can contact me directly, or I encourage you to participate in that public input process. Let your thoughts be known. Learn more about that program. And with that, I'm happy to open the discussion and also to just offer out to anybody, if you have questions about the disease, you have questions about elk in general, and want to learn more, you can email me. My contact information is here, and this is my cell phone number. I'm working from home for the time being, so that's the only way to really get a hold of me. And with that, Kara, I think maybe we open it up to discussion.
Yeah, I've got some good questions here. I'm going to start with the first one and go in order. So if you can answer these kind of quickly, we might be able to get through all of them. Okay. The first one is this hair wart in dairy and beef cows?
Yeah, so I think a synonym is that hairy heelwort or strawberry heel or strawberry wart or raspberry heel.
Great. Was it surprising to see all elk in the study, which was on slide 17, either in marginal or poor body condition, even if not infected? Any thoughts on what's causing this?
Yeah, so it's unfortunately not all that surprising because we do have a long history of documented chronically nutritionally challenged animals in that population. It's all a function of what the habitat that's out there and what was available. And when the disease got into Mount St. Helens, we were actually in the process of lowering the population to try to make the number of animals more in balance with the habitat that was out there. But we were kind of too late. And by the time we started issuing those extra permits to reduce that density, reduce competition for resources, the disease came in and prevalence just skyrocketed. So it wasn't necessarily surprising, and there's actually a pretty long and well-documented history of nutritional stress and nutritional inadequacy of a lot of the habitats in the Pacific Northwest. So it's all a function of the way forests are managed and the primary productivity that is out there on the landscape. And as those stands start to close, you start to lose the resources.
Great. Of the 4 elk in the study that were harvested, did they have collars and tags? Or were hunters asked not to harvest collared elk?
Yeah, they did have collars and tags, and we did not ask them to not harvest radio collars. We wanted natural harvest to be estimated and incorporated into this study, so we didn't ask hunters to avoid it, but that is something that often other wildlife radio collaring efforts do, but not in this case.
Right. Okay. It sounds like online reporting from the public continues to be important. In addition, are there other actions the public should be doing or not doing to help limit spread of this disease?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's always tough because I don't want to give an unsatisfying answer because I want folks to have enthusiasm and I want them to be engaged in the process and in part of the solution. I think the most important thing you can do is remain an advocate, remain interested, inform yourself, learn as much as you can about the disease, disseminate that information. There's still a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about this disease. Continue to report, stay in touch with me, get interested in the disease and what Washington State University is doing. They've got a really exciting program that's underway that we're working with them on, but they've got great information and a lot of interesting research is coming down the pipe from that program. And stay engaged. I mentioned that 3-year season setting process. If you've got an interest in that, please participate in that. Let your thoughts be known, whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea. That's really, we're managing these wildlife in the public trust, and we want to hear from you. So stay engaged.
Is there any indication that some elk have natural immunity other than good body condition?
This is, I think, the part where I need to say that I'm not a veterinarian. So I think that there's no real sign that we have any idea of some sort of genetic predisposition to either, an immunity or an ability to fight the disease or not. I think that the nutrition and body condition are playing a big role. It's hard to tease those things out though, because an animal in poor nutritional condition more susceptible to getting the disease. That makes sense. It's just it has fewer resources to fight the disease, and a very simple heuristic. Or an animal gets sick and is therefore fighting the disease, spending more resources fighting the disease, and becomes in poor condition. It's this chicken and the egg question that both of those things are probably happening. We can't really tease out, but as far as natural immunity or anything like that, I don't think we have any evidence to suggest that, at least not from the work that we've done.
Okay. Could the use of forest herbicides that reduce elk dietary component contribute to their poor health, thereby predisposing the elk to this disease?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that's a tough one also to disentangle. So the immediate impact of forest herbicides and the herbicides that we use in Western Washington, yes, they are diminishing the amount of forage which is available in that stand, that clear cut that was just logged. Normally, you'd have a few years there where you have that regeneration of forbs and shrubs, which are good food for elk. But those treatments of herbicides do, in that near term, in that short window, reduce the amount of forage which is available. But what happens what research has shown in southwestern Washington, at least, is that at a landscape level, there's a mosaic of mixed age stands that have different, this one was cut and treated 10 years ago, this one was 5, this one was 20, that at that landscape level, there's probably enough forage resources to support elk in general. Now it's about balancing how much is out there, how many elk are out there with that mosaic. And then after a few years of treatment, the level of forage which is available in a treated stand is equivalent to what you find in an untreated stand, with some differences in like the composition of forage.
Will there be any efforts to keep elk off wet pastures and away from cattle and livestock?
Well, it would be in a perfect world, maybe. It's something that we've talked about. One of those, you can kind of try to treat the habitat or the environment. You can try to go after the host, or you can try to go after the pathogens. That would kind of be that environment and keeping them out of some sort of environmental reservoir. Frankly, we don't know enough about that environmental reservoir and how much transmission is happening is mediated through the environment. And we don't know about transmission from livestock to elk and elk to livestock. We don't have any evidence that suggests that happens. Just that we know the microbial profile is very similar. So to try to fence elk out of pastures and go to that effort and go to extra regulations and that thing, we just don't have the evidence of probably enough. Well, certainly probably it would be a voluntary kind of program. We do a lot of hazing, but unfortunately, there's only so much you can do. Elk are really, they go nocturnal, that kind of thing. So it's a challenge, but it's a good idea. Just its feasibility and its impact, its effect size might not be that great.
So how does the condition of elk compare with the general physical condition of other wildlife in the same area?
It's a good question. I don't know if we have any data to really offer there. We don't capture a lot of black-tailed deer at large numbers, and we don't do the level of body condition assessments. Here, we had an expert in this body condition assessment that not only is palpating the animal and doing a raw score based on its physical condition, but we're also using ultrasounds to measure the fat depth. And there's a lot of research and models which have been developed from captive elk that we use to extrapolate that ingesta-free body fat estimate. So we really don't have anything to compare. I'd have to look. There has been some research on foraging ecology of black-tailed deer in southwestern Washington, but I'm not sure we really have a good comparative analysis there. But from what we know, black-tailed deer populations are doing pretty well in that area.
Great. Well, Kyle, that was all the questions we had, and it is 12:58, so I think it's probably safe to call it good. Thank you so much for your time. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else did as well. And if you have any further questions for Kyle, feel free to reach out to him at his email that's on the screen or the phone number. Also, you can always contact the Ag Forestry office if you have any further questions. This webinar will be available on our Ag Forestry website under our events tab, hopefully by next week. So if you missed it or you want to review anything that should be in that space. Again, Kyle, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to learning more about this in the future.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for everyone who attended, and thanks for the questions. And like Kara said, please reach out if you have any more questions. Always happy to talk.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.